So,
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Gadfly City Live with me, Monica Cardenas. Don't forget to subscribe to Gadfly City on Substack and YouTube, wherever you're watching. And today, here with me, I have Michelle Cuppersmith, who's Executive Director of the Campaign for Accountability. Welcome, Michelle.
thank you so much for having me, Monica.
Thanks for being here. The Campaign for Accountability is a nonpartisan nonprofit watchdog that exposes misconduct and malfeasance in public life. I know you have a specific tech transparency project that we'll talk about in a minute, but can you tell me a little bit more about what kind of misconduct CFA is looking for and how you expose it?
Of course. So I come from a background as a private investigator and
Mm.
joined the nonprofit accountability world about a decade ago. And we are focused on identifying misconduct by businesses, nonprofits, and elected officials or appointed officials, folks that have government bodies that give oversight to them. And then we find out what they're doing, either through tips or generalized research or from news articles. And then we send letters to the appropriate oversight body and ask them to do investigations because we're only available, the only information available to us as an outside nonprofit is publicly accessible information. But we sort of, I like to call them very, very well researched tips. We hand them over, we tell them all the facts, and then what are the legal violations. And we say, to like whatever oversight body is the inspector general or the,
Mhm.
Office of Congressional Ethics and say, okay, now take it from here. You have tools that we don't have access to.
Okay, wow. It sounds like would make a great true crime series background.
Yes, I say it's a great job to have at parties.
Yeah. How does the work that you do support everyday people, do you think?
Well, I think we work on a lot of topics that, folks might not realize impact their daily lives, but it's sort of like trickle down policy almost. So there are so many factors at play in how our daily lives are controlled. Like I like to say, there's a crack in the sidewalk because things are not working correctly. The government agencies
Mhm.
should be paying attention to that. And so what we seek to do is find out if there are folks in positions of power that are manipulating the rules or doing things that are disadvantageous or to the normal person but advantageous for themselves. So,
Mm.
for example, like we filed a bar complaint just last week against Todd Blanche about his prosecution of Kilmar Arbrego Garcia and how that seemed to be politically motivated. And you have to like question, are those resources that are being spent by U.S. Attorney's Office the best adjudicated when it could be
Mhm.
used to be going after like, actual crimes that impact daily people, like the daily lives of people, as you asked. So it's
Mhm.
like almost it's a little bit diffuse, I suppose. You wouldn't necessarily think of it that way, but it's more like if someone in power is doing something wrong, it's means that they're spending time doing that instead of doing the right thing.
Right, okay, yeah, yeah, and they're all people that are in sort of a public service position, so the way they do their jobs does impact everyone.
Sure. Or like, for example, we filed an SEC complaint against a deep sea mining company, which is like something that exists. We're so desperate for resources that we're like going into the middle of the ocean and digging deep into the ground, like, thousands of leagues under the sea looking for stuff. And like
Hmm.
that company we thought was violating, SEC rules and its public offering by obfuscating or not including facts about its executives. And those are companies that are looking for, government authority to do like drilling in the middle of the ocean. And if you
Mhm.
are handing that over to companies that are run by people that are not, working in good faith, like you could end up with really bad environmental impact, for example. So our sort of theory of the case is that, when people are doing things for themselves, it's probably going to have a negative impact on just, normal Americans.
Yeah, yeah, okay. You mentioned the investigation of Todd Blanche just a minute ago, and I just wanna remind everyone about Kilmore Brigo Garcia. He was one of the most well known people at the start of these ICE raids that we saw at the beginning of last year. So the he was deported by ICE to CCOT, the prison in El Salvador, and was later returned under curious circumstances. So, can you tell us what outcome you're looking for in that case?
Of course. So we've filed many bar complaints in the past year and a half, I guess it's been. It's felt like longer, against Trump administration attorneys who we believe are violating the codes of ethics that they have agreed to when they became lawyers. So, every state has different like oversight bodies. They're generally privately adjudicated, but some states like New York, it's also through the court system that attorneys are barred. And those bodies are tasked with upholding or making sure that the lawyers who are under their jurisdiction are abiding by all applicable ethics rules. And
Mhm.
so we've filed complaints with different bar associations or with the courts that oversee lawyers in New York and New Jersey, Tennessee, Virginia, Florida, against Lindsay Halligan, John Sarcone, Alina Habba, those types of folks. And so that's what we were asking for with Todd Blanche, is we're asking for the bar to continue its investigation that we had already started for them, more or less,
Mhm.
um, because of his behavior. And we hinged a lot of that on the judge's most recent ruling about this, that it seemed like malicious prosecution and politically motivated and not in the best interest of the folks that the U.S. Attorney's Office is supposed to serve, and DOJ is supposed to serve, I should say. So we we're asking for some sort of discipline for this bad behavior. And we saw, like in the past, that Rudy Giuliani was actually disbarred for behavior
Mhm.
that he engaged in as an attorney, as an attorney. And so that's sort of like the most, I guess, harsh version of discipline. But there's other intermediary steps like a suspension or some sort of like mark on your record, so that people, like, judges, like when you're a public lawyer, right, working for DOJ or wherever, you want it to be known, like Americans, all of us should want it to be known that these lawyers have some sort of mark on their record, right? That like
Mhm.
judges should maybe take them a little less seriously, or at least have like a little bit wider eyes about who they're dealing with. And juries as well, and just anyone who's involved, like opposing counsel, should know about that. So there's different, I think, shades of what could be the outcome of those. But basically we're asking the bar under which Todd Blanche is barred to like do something, like
Yeah.
you have a responsibility here.
Right, right. Okay. I think having an example like that of the work that you do is useful, especially because that story is something, I think, were following last year. It was, front page news for weeks. So obviously, though, the internet and technology continue to change so much about how we live and work. So I want to ask you more about the Tech Transparency Project that you oversee. What is it? How was it set up, and why?
Great question. And if you can believe it, we've been doing that work for more than a decade, back when, all the big tech companies were still considered kind of the good guys. And so we
Mhm.
were a little bit like out in the wilderness in terms of that work. It actually, that project started as the Google Transparency Project, because if we cannot think all the way back to like 2015, actually the Obama White House was kind of a revolving door for Google execs.
Mm.
And that's really where it started, was looking at the influence of Google on the Obama administration. And were these people, like Eric Schmidt, actually working on behalf, like bringing their positions to the federal government from a position of altruism or to represent Google's interests?
Mhm.
And things have morphed greatly. Obviously, we now are called the Tech Transparency Project because we expanded our focus to many of the big tech platforms, including, I mean, most prominently Meta at this point. And from the Google perspective, there's also YouTube under that auspice, under the Alphabet auspice. I would say that those are like two of the biggest companies that we are concerned about.
Mhm.
To also X, of course, we've been doing a lot of work there, and since the ownership transition. And our work there runs the gamut of what kind of research we do. So that's much more of like a research focused lane where we put out reports, talking about the ways that these big companies are either unduly influencing legislators, or how they're breaking their own guidelines about content, or how they're violating US sanctions rules by giving, paid accounts to sanctioned individuals. So the
Mhm.
overall, goal is not to like kill tech. We're not Luddites or anything of that nature, but it's more to hold tech companies to the same standards that you would hold any company. And as you noted, they're changing our everyday lives in a thousand ways, every moment.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and I guess in ways that, most people probably wouldn't notice on a day-to-day basis using those services, but,
Mhm.
that's something that you're looking at and, following up on. What are you mentioned some of the things that become issues under that project, like, you said giving accounts to who?
So we've done a whole string of reports, like, and that's one of our things that we like to do is we don't just leave a story. Like we do one report and then never check back on it. Like a
Mhm.
big like focus of ours is to say, okay, we do one report exposing something, and then we'll check back and we'll continuously check to see if the platform has made any changes to that based on our
Okay.
report. And so, my gosh, probably almost 2 years ago now, we found that there were individuals, sanctioned individuals on X who appeared to have paid accounts,
Okay.
and our whole, and we've been doing follow-up reports on that for like 2 years now. And so the whole idea, right, is that if those folks are paying for those accounts, then that would violate US sanctions laws, because US companies are not allowed to do business with sanctioned individuals.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was a lot of like about, specifically Hezbollah figures, that kind of thing. And we've really stayed on that for years now. Oh my gosh, time flies when you're having fun on this kind of work. And so that's one, yeah, that was one project that we've done, but I'm happy to talk about other ones.
Well, did you notice an improvement using that example when you've done your follow-up reports?
Yeah, we did. I mean, certainly, a lot of times these individuals will then be removed, but it's
Mhm.
kind of like a bit of a whack-a-mole, because it feels like the platforms in a lot of ways, and this goes back, I don't know if you recall the Frances Haugen hearings. I mean, I think those are back in 2021, where she said, she was a former Meta employee. She said, the platforms have made kind of a decision, or at least from her perspective, Meta had made a decision to not really invest in like human moderation, that
Mhm.
they're relying on what we called at the time algorithms. Now we would call that AI, right? To do a
Mhm.
lot of the work for them in terms of content moderation. Now I know that there are stories about folks that are like, being forced to look at horrible, content on these platforms. But either, I don't know, I've never worked at one of these companies, but like the sort of theory is that these companies have made a business decision, right, to not really invest in content moderation, or even in like the moderation of like who can get an account, because it just doesn't make sense
Okay.
to them,
Yeah.
right? Like there's like, how often have you seen like a penalty from the US
Right.
against one of these companies?
Rarely.
So yeah, right. So that's what I mean, it's like a little bit of a David and Goliath situation, but like we do see ourselves as very important in that role to
Mhm.
continue showing how the platforms are falling down in the job. And yes, there's certainly improvement. I mean, but it's just like, should we really have to be the ones to keep doing that? I wish that there was,
Yeah.
we hope and we pray that we can be put out of business, right? That like the government passes regulations that make the platforms be held accountable, but we have Section 230, and that's a whole problem. So
Okay. It sounds like there's a lot more we could get into.
totally.
Is there any way that regular people can support the Campaign for Accountability?
Definitely, you can always make a donation on our website, campaignforaccountability.org, that supports both our regular accountability work and the tech transparency project. You can follow us on X accountable_org. You can always go to our website and send us tips. You can send them directly to our email, info@campaignforaccountability.org. So much of our information is crowdsourced, so we love it when people email us.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Michelle, for being here and everyone for watching. And again, don't forget to subscribe to Gadfly City on Substack and YouTube. Until next time, bye.